The sun dipped below the horizon, casting an amber glow over the pristine beach. The vacation was meant to be an escape, a reward for surviving the grind of the city. Sarah and Ben had chosen an isolated coastal village, far from the tourist crowds, lured by promises of serenity and untouched beauty. The brochures had called it heaven on earth, but the villagers' wary eyes told a different story. Their rental cottage stood at the edge of the jungle, its wooden frame creaking as the ocean breeze swept through the shutters. It was quaint but charming, with no Wi-Fi or TV, just the kind of detox they had craved. On their first evening, as the couple sipped wine on the porch, a strange figure emerged from the trees. An old man, hunched and silent, stared at them from a distance. He wore ragged clothes and carried a crude fishing spear. His face was gaunt, skin leathery from years in the sun. He didn't speak, just watched, as if gauging whether they belonged. Ben called out, waving cheerfully, but the man simply turned and shuffled back into the jungle. "Friendly place," Ben joked, though Sarah felt a chill despite the warmth of the evening. The second night, a distant drumming echoed from deep within the jungle. It started faintly, almost imperceptible over the crashing waves, but grew louder as the hours passed. Sarah woke first, her chest tight with unease. She nudged Ben, who groggily dismissed it as a local festival. But when the sounds shifted to guttural chants and a low, rhythmic hum, he sat up, frowning. "That doesn't sound normal," he muttered. By dawn, the drumming had ceased. The village seemed deserted when they ventured in for supplies. Stalls that had been bustling with fruit sellers and fishmongers were now shuttered. Even the stray dogs that had followed them on their first day were nowhere to be seen. Only the old man remained, sitting cross-legged near the pier. His milky white eyes met Sarah's as she passed, and he muttered something under his breath, a language she couldn't understand, but the tone was unmistakably a warning. Ben laughed it off again, though less convincingly this time. "Just superstitious locals," he said, as they hurried back to the cottage. "Probably some weird regional holiday." That night, the drumming resumed, louder, closer. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as though the jungle itself was alive and watching. Sarah couldn't sleep, her mind replaying the old man's hollow gaze. Just past midnight, Ben shook her awake, his face pale. "Do you hear that?" It wasn't the drums this time. It was whispering, soft, sibilant voices just outside the window. Ben peeked through the curtains, his breath hitching. "There's someone out there." Sarah joined him, heart pounding. Shadows moved just beyond the tree line, flickering between the trunks. Their shapes were human, but something was wrong. Elongated limbs, unnatural gaits. One of them stepped closer, its face obscured by a mask made of bone. In its hands, it clutched a bundle of sticks, bound with what looked like human hair. It raised the bundle high, and the whispering grew louder, mingling with a low, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from the jungle itself. "Turn off the lights," Sarah hissed. Ben obeyed, plunging the room into darkness. They crouched by the bed, holding their breaths as the whispers grew deafening. Something scratched against the window, slow and deliberate. The door handle rattled. Ben grabbed a kitchen knife, motioning for Sarah to stay quiet. The scratching stopped, and for a moment there was only silence. Then, a deafening bang shattered the stillness as the door burst open. The bone-masked figure stood in the doorway, its empty eyes locking onto Sarah. Behind it, more shapes emerged, their bodies twisting unnaturally as they crawled into the room. Ben lunged with the knife, but the figure moved with inhuman speed, grabbing his wrist and twisting until the blade clattered to the floor. Sarah screamed, scrambling for the door, but the other figures blocked her path. Their masks seemed to shift, the bone surfaces morphing into grotesque faces, human and animal, yet neither. The last thing Sarah remembered was the guttural chanting rising to a crescendo as the figures closed in, their shadows consuming her vision. When the villagers found the cottage days later, it was empty. The furniture was overturned, the walls smeared with dark, unidentifiable stains. The old man stood at the edge of the jungle, shaking his head. "They never listen," he muttered to himself. The drumming started again that night.
Story number 2.
The damp chill of the highland air clung to Marie's skin as she stepped out of the rental car. The ancient stone manor loomed before her, its crumbling turrets reaching toward the swirling gray sky. Her boyfriend Paul stood beside her, excitement lighting his face. "This place is perfect," he said, snapping photos of the sprawling estate. Marie wasn't so sure. The property, which they'd found on a vacation home rental app, felt more like a ruin than the charming, secluded retreat it had promised. The caretaker had handed them the keys earlier that day without a word of explanation. His silence had been unnerving, and when Marie pressed him about the property's history, he had muttered, "You'll see." The house's interior smelled of mildew and dust. Faded portraits of grim-faced ancestors hung crookedly on the walls. A grand staircase spiraled upward, its wood creaking underfoot as they explored the rooms. The windows were so grimy that only a faint, sickly light filtered through. Marie tried to shake the unease, chalking it up to jet lag. Paul, ever the adventurer, insisted on exploring the woods behind the manor before nightfall. "Come on," he called, pulling on her hand. "It's all part of the experience." The forest was dense, the trees knotted together in unnatural shapes. As they ventured deeper, Marie noticed strange markings carved into the trunks, symbols that looked neither ancient nor modern. "What do you think these mean?" she asked, her voice low. Paul shrugged. "Probably some old superstition. This area is full of weird folklore." The sun dipped lower, and a peculiar stillness fell over the forest. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive silence that made every breath feel louder. Paul froze mid-step. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. Marie strained her ears. At first there was nothing. Then, faintly, she caught it. A low, guttural sound, almost like a growl coming from deeper in the woods. "Let's head back," she urged. Paul hesitated, his curiosity battling with the primal urge to retreat. Finally he nodded. As they turned, the growling grew louder, accompanied by the crunch of leaves. It was behind them now, and it was moving fast. "Run!" Paul shouted. They bolted through the trees, branches snagging their clothes and clawing at their skin. The sound grew impossibly close, like hot breath against their necks. Bursting out of the forest, they slammed the door of the manor behind them, locking it tight. Paul was panting, his face pale. "What the hell was that?" Marie demanded, her voice shaking. "I don't know," he said, glancing nervously at the window. "But it stopped when we got here." That night, the howling began. It wasn't the wind, Marie was sure of it. The sound was mournful and hollow, echoing through the empty halls of the manor. She tried to convince herself it was an animal, but when the whispers started, soft, insidious voices just beyond the bedroom door, her denial cracked. Paul insisted it was their imagination, but when he reached for the door handle to prove it, the whispers stopped. A sharp, heavy thud followed, as though something enormous had thrown itself against the door. "We need to leave," Marie said, gripping his arm. "In the dark? Through that forest?" Paul shook his head. "We'll wait until morning." Morning never came. The next time Marie opened her eyes, the room was suffused with an unnatural, gray light. Paul was gone. His side of the bed was cold. The whispers were louder now, circling her. She stumbled out of the room, calling his name, her voice echoing down the endless halls. She found him in the dining room, standing perfectly still, his back to her. "Paul?" she called softly. He didn't move. As she stepped closer, the air around him grew icy. "Paul, stop messing around." She reached out, her hand trembling, and touched his shoulder. His head snapped around unnaturally fast, his eyes wide and empty, his mouth stretched into a silent scream. Before she could react, he collapsed to the floor, his body crumpling like a rag doll. The whispers turned into laughter. The portraits on the walls seemed to shift, the faces smiling now, their eyes following her. Marie backed away, her mind racing. She had to get out. She sprinted to the front door, but when she threw it open, the forest was there, impossibly close. The manor was surrounded by trees that hadn't been there before. She ran back inside, desperate, but the rooms were no longer the same. Hallways twisted in impossible directions. Doors opened to nowhere or back into the same room. And then she saw them. Shadows, dozens of them, their limbs too long, their faces obscured by darkness. They moved silently, closing in. Marie screamed as the first one reached for her. When the caretaker returned a week later to collect the keys, the house was silent. He didn't need to check inside. He had seen it before. The faces in the windows, pale and terrified, forever trapped. The manor always welcomed new guests.
Story number 3.
The mountain resort was a last-minute choice, nestled deep in the wilderness and far from civilization. Sophie had needed the break, a solo retreat to clear her head after a brutal breakup. She wasn't afraid of being alone, she told herself. The stillness of the pine-covered peaks and the isolation of the off-season were exactly what she wanted. The hotel, a sprawling timber structure with only a few other cars in the lot, had a rustic charm. The front desk clerk, a young woman with a forced smile, handed Sophie her key. "You're in room 214. she said, sliding the keycard across the desk. "Just a heads up. Don't use the stairs on the west side of the building." Sophie frowned. "Why not?" The clerk hesitated. "There. Not safe." That vague response lingered in Sophie's mind as she settled into her room. The decor was dated but cozy, with a large picture window offering a view of the forest. She spent the day hiking and returned as twilight draped the resort in shadow. Her first uneasy moment came at dinner. The dining hall was nearly empty except for a few other guests who all kept their heads down, eating in silence. The atmosphere felt heavy, like everyone was avoiding something. Sophie dismissed it, though the flickering chandelier overhead added to the unease. Later that night, as she lay in bed reading, Sophie heard it, a faint creak, like a footstep in the hallway outside her room. She froze, straining to listen. Another creak, then silence. She opened the door cautiously, peeking into the dimly lit corridor. No one was there. With a nervous laugh, she blamed her overactive imagination and shut the door. At 2 a.m., she woke to the sound of someone whispering. It was faint, almost unintelligible, but undeniably there. It came from the direction of the west stairwell. She pulled on a hoodie and stepped into the hall, clutching her phone for light. The whispers grew louder as she approached the stairwell, morphing into what sounded like sobbing. Her heart pounded as she reached the door labeled Stairs West Wing. The sobbing stopped. Sophie hesitated, then pushed the door open. The stairwell was dark, the overhead lights flickering weakly. A faint metallic smell hung in the air. She pointed her phone's flashlight downward and froze. Halfway down the stairs, a wet handprint smeared the wall, crimson against the pale concrete. Her breath caught. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. A scraping sound answered, coming from below, something heavy being dragged across the floor. Panic surged through her, and she backed away, letting the door close. She ran back to her room, locking the door and wedging a chair under the handle for good measure. She didn't sleep. The next morning, she told the clerk what had happened. The woman paled but didn't seem surprised. "It's probably just the pipes," she said unconvincingly. Sophie decided to cut her trip short. She packed her bags and headed to the elevator. As the doors slid open, a man stepped out, unkempt, with wild eyes and dirt-streaked clothes. He muttered something under his breath as he brushed past her, reeking of damp earth. She rushed to the front desk. "Who is that man?" she demanded. The clerk looked puzzled. "What man?" When Sophie turned back, the elevator was empty. Her unease deepened as she checked out and loaded her bags into her car. She glanced back at the hotel one last time. In the second-floor window, her window, a figure stood watching her. It was herself. Her exact reflection, except the face wasn't hers. It smiled. Sophie didn't stop driving until she reached the nearest town, where she called the police. When they investigated the hotel, they found nothing. No guests, no clerk, not even her belongings. The resort had been abandoned for over a decade, its last visitors disappearing without a trace. Sophie still dreams of that window, and every time she looks into a mirror, she wonders if the face looking back is truly her own.
Story number 4.
The cruise had been Olivia's dream vacation for years. A week on a luxurious ship, endless food, sparkling pools, and turquoise ocean as far as the eye could see. She had saved for months, and now, finally, she was here. She couldn't have known it would be the last vacation she'd ever take. The first few days were perfect. She lounged on the deck with a cocktail, explored the sprawling ship, and danced late into the night at the onboard nightclub. The passengers were friendly, the crew accommodating. But on the third night, something changed. Olivia woke to the sound of knocking. It was faint, barely perceptible over the hum of the ship's engine, but persistent. She groggily checked her phone. 3:13 a.m. "Who is it?" she called out. No answer. She got up and opened the door, expecting to see a drunken passenger at the wrong cabin. But the hallway was empty, silent except for the faint sound of waves outside. Shrugging it off, she locked the door and went back to bed. The next morning, she overheard 2 passengers at breakfast whispering about a missing woman. She was supposed to meet her friend for drinks, one of them said, glancing around nervously. Never showed up. And her cabin, it was locked from the inside. Olivia felt a chill creep up her spine, but shook it off. These big cruise ships were like floating cities. People wandered off or got lost all the time. That night, the knocking came again, louder this time, more urgent. Olivia sat up in bed, heart racing. "Who's there?" she demanded. Again, silence. Summoning her courage, she opened the door. The hallway was empty. But as she turned to go back inside, she noticed something strange. Wet footprints trailed down the carpeted hall, leading away from her cabin. She followed them, her curiosity overriding her fear. The prince stopped abruptly at the door to the west stairwell. She hesitated, then pushed the door open. The stairwell was dark, the emergency lights casting an eerie red glow. She descended cautiously, her breath echoing in the confined space. At the bottom, she found a utility door slightly ajar. Inside was a storage room filled with cleaning supplies and tools, and in the center of the room was a single shoe, high-heeled black, encrusted with salt. She recognized it. She'd seen the missing woman wearing it at the nightclub on the first night. Her stomach churned as she backed away. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. She returned to her cabin, double-checking the lock before crawling into bed. She didn't sleep. The next morning, the mood on the ship was different. Crew members whispered among themselves, casting anxious glances at passengers. Rumors spread that another person had vanished. Olivia stayed in her room most of the day, uneasy but unsure of what to do. That night, the knocking came again, louder than ever, almost frantic. Olivia didn't answer. She sat frozen in her bed, clutching the blanket, staring at the door. Then the knocking stopped. The silence stretched, thick and oppressive. She thought it was over, until she heard the soft, wet drip, drip, drip of water. She turned toward the bathroom where the sound was coming from. The door was closed, but a shadow moved beneath the crack, slow and deliberate. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The shadow paused, then the bathroom door creaked open, revealing nothing. The room was empty, but the sink was running, the water ice cold. On the mirror, written in the condensation, were 3 words: "Don't look down." Trembling, Olivia backed away, her heart hammering in her chest. Her heel hit something wet. Slowly, she looked down. A puddle had formed on the carpet, black and oily, and in its reflection, she saw something that wasn't there. A pale, bloated face staring up at her from the depths. Its mouth twisted into a wide, unnatural grin, water pouring from its lips. Olivia screamed and ran from the cabin, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. She burst onto the deck, gasping for air, but the ship seemed deserted. No passengers, no crew, just endless water and the sound of her own ragged breathing. Then she heard it, the knocking. Not from her cabin this time, but from beneath the deck. She peered over the railing, her stomach lurching. A pale hand pressed against the ship's hull just below the surface. And then another, and another. The water churned with shadows, too many to count, their bloated faces staring up at her, mouths moving silently as if calling her to join them. The ship's horn blared, deafening, and she felt hands, real, solid hands, grabbing her shoulders. A crew member was shaking her, yelling something she couldn't hear over the sound of the horn. When she came to, she was back in her cabin. The crew told her she'd been found wandering the deck, mumbling incoherently about water and faces. They assured her it was just a nightmare, perhaps seasickness. But Olivia knew the truth. The cruise ended 3 days later. Olivia left the ship, vowing never to set foot on open water again. Weeks passed, and the nightmares didn't stop. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, couldn't unhear the knocking that now came from her apartment walls. One night, as she lay in bed, she heard it again, soft, insistent, coming from the bathroom. She closed her eyes, willing it to stop. But when she opened them, she wasn't in her room anymore. She was back on the ship, staring into the black water, the pale faces waiting below.
Story number 5.
The cabin in the woods wasn't where Mia wanted to be, but her friends had insisted. "It's going to be fun," Jenna had said, nudging her toward the idea of a weekend getaway. No phones, no stress, just us and nature. Mia had reluctantly agreed, but as the group of 5 drove deeper into the forest, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were leaving something behind, something important. By the time they reached the cabin, nestled in a clearing surrounded by towering pines, the sun was already setting. It was picturesque in a lonely, unsettling way. The cabin was old, with sagging beams and a wraparound porch that creaked under their weight. Inside, the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and damp. The first night passed uneventfully, though Mia thought she heard faint scratching at the windows while the others slept. She told herself it was just animals. On the second day, they hiked through the woods, marveling at the dense canopy and the eerie stillness. The deeper they went, the quieter it became, as though the forest were holding its breath. "Have you noticed there aren't any birds?" Mia asked. "Maybe it's just the time of year," Ben replied, shrugging. But that wasn't it. The air felt thick, oppressive. Even the trees seemed wrong, their trunks gnarled and twisted, their bark peeling back to reveal deep gouges that looked like claw marks. Jenna found the first doll hanging from a low branch. It was small and crudely made, fashioned from sticks and string. Its head was a bundle of dried grass, and something about its emptiness made Mia's stomach churn. "Creepy," Jenna said, taking a picture with her phone. "You shouldn't do that," Mia muttered. "Why not? It's just a stupid doll." By the time they returned to the cabin, the sun was setting again, casting long shadows across the clearing. Jenna went to upload the photo, only to find her phone screen frozen. "Weird," she said, frowning. "It won't turn off." Mia didn't say anything, but unease prickled at her skin. That night, the scratching was louder. It wasn't an animal. It couldn't be. The sound moved from one window to another, then to the door, slow and deliberate, as though something outside was circling the cabin. Ben grabbed a flashlight and flung open the door. "There's nothing out here," he called, waving the beam into the darkness. The light caught something, a glint of eyes in the tree line. "Get inside," Mia hissed, pulling him back. The door slammed shut, and for a moment the group huddled together in silence, listening. Then Jenna screamed. In the corner of the room, a doll identical to the one they'd found in the woods now sat on the floor. "No one brought that in here, right?" Jenna whispered, her voice trembling. "No one would," Mia said, her throat dry. The group stayed up all night, too scared to sleep. But as dawn broke, they convinced themselves it was just a prank, one of the others messing with the group. They decided to leave, but when they piled into the car, the engine wouldn't start. "Battery's dead," Ben said, his voice tight. "Of course it is," Mia muttered. They decided to hike back toward the road and call for help when they got service. The forest felt different now, the trees closer together, the light dimmer despite the rising sun. The path they had followed before seemed to twist in ways it hadn't. Jenna found another doll hanging from a branch, then another. Soon they were everywhere, dangling from the trees, their eyeless faces turned toward the group. "We're going in circles," Ben said, his voice cracking. "How are we going in circles?" The path was gone. The trees grew tighter, pressing in on all sides. "Stop!" Mia shouted suddenly, grabbing Jenna's arm. She pointed ahead, where a figure stood between the trees. It was tall and thin, with a gaunt face and long, spindly limbs. Its head tilted unnaturally to the side as it watched them. When it moved, its joints cracked like dry wood. "Run!" Ben shouted. They bolted, crashing through the underbrush, the sound of cracking limbs and heavy footsteps following close behind. Mia didn't dare look back. When they reached the cabin, they slammed the door shut, barricading it with whatever they could find. The thing outside didn't knock, didn't try to force its way in. It just stood there, visible through the window, watching. As the hours passed, the group realized the sun wasn't moving. The day refused to end, trapping them in an endless twilight. By the next morning, or what should have been morning, Jenna was gone. No one saw her leave, but her bed was empty, and her boots were missing. They found her that evening, hanging from a tree, a doll clutched in her lifeless hands. The cabin was later found abandoned, all 5 friends missing. But deep in the forest, new dolls began to appear, dangling from the branches, waiting for their next visitors.
Story number 6.
The remote island was supposed to be a paradise. Mia and her boyfriend Lucas had booked a week-long stay in a luxurious bungalow perched over crystal-clear water. No phones, no distractions, just them and the ocean. The resort's glossy photos promised privacy, but they didn't mention how isolated the island truly was. The first day was perfect. They swam, lounged under the sun, and drank tropical cocktails. That night, as they lay in bed listening to the gentle lapping of the waves, Mia thought she'd never felt more at peace. The first odd thing happened the next morning. As they were eating breakfast on the deck, Mia noticed something floating in the water. It looked like a bundle of seaweed at first, but as it drifted closer, she realized it was a doll, its porcelain face chipped and waterlogged. "Creepy," Lucas said, fishing it out with a net. "How do you think this got all the way out here?" "Maybe a tourist dropped it," Mia suggested, though she felt an odd chill. Lucas left the doll on the dock, and they forgot about it as the day went on. That night, Mia woke to a sound. Soft splashing, like something moving in the water below the bungalow. She sat up, peering out the window, but the moonlit waves looked calm. She blamed her imagination and went back to sleep. In the morning, the doll was gone. "Must have floated away," Lucas said with a shrug. But that night splashing returned, louder this time. Mia shook Lucas awake. "Listen." He groaned, but sat up. The sound stopped. "You're hearing things," he muttered, rolling over. Mia wasn't so sure. The next day, they decided to explore the island. The resort staff had warned them not to wander too far. There are areas we haven't mapped yet, they'd said, but Lucas convinced Mia to follow a narrow trail into the jungle. The air grew heavy as they walked, the dense foliage blocking out the sun. The trail twisted and turned, and soon they realized they weren't on a path at all. "I think we should head back," Mia said, her voice tight. Lucas sighed. "Okay, but..." He froze. Ahead of them, in the shadow of a large tree, something stood. It was small, human-shaped, and unmoving. It was a doll. Its porcelain face was pristine, its eyes painted a brilliant blue. A faint smile curved its lips, but the longer Mia looked, the more it seemed like it was smirking. Lucas reached for it, but Mia grabbed his arm. "Don't touch it." "Why not?" "It's just a doll. Please," she whispered, her stomach churning with a nameless dread. Reluctantly, Lucas stepped back, and they hurried back to the bungalow. That night, Mia couldn't sleep. She kept hearing things, the splash of water, the creak of the bungalow's wooden supports, the faint sound of giggling. She nudged Lucas awake again, but he was groggy and dismissive. Frustrated, she sat on the edge of the bed, staring out the window. The water was still, the moonlight shimmered, and then she saw it. A pale figure floated just below the surface, its long hair drifting like seaweed. Mia gasped, scrambling back. "Lucas, look!" By the time Lucas joined her, the figure was gone. "Mia, there's nothing there. You're freaking yourself out." "I know what I saw," she insisted, but he didn't believe her. The next morning, Lucas was gone. Mia woke to find his side of the bed empty, his shoes missing. She ran to the deck, calling his name, but the water was calm and empty. Panic set in as she searched the island, screaming for him. When she reached the resort's main building, it was abandoned. The staff, the other guests, everyone had vanished. She ran back to the bungalow only to stop short. On the deck, propped against the railing, was the doll. Its blue eyes seemed to gleam in the sunlight, its faint smirk mocking her. And in its tiny porcelain hands, it held Lucas's watch. Mia didn't remember packing. She didn't remember boarding the small boat she found tied to the dock. All she knew was that she had to leave. She paddled for hours, the island growing smaller behind her until the waves swallowed it entirely. She told herself she was safe, but when she finally reached another island, crawling onto the shore, she saw it waiting for her on the sand. The doll, its perfect blue eyes unblinking, its porcelain face smiling. This time, it was holding her necklace. No one knows what happened to Mia, but locals say the island is cursed. They warn travelers never to stray too far from the resort, never to touch anything they find, and above all, never to take a doll back with them.
Story number 7.
The road trip had been spontaneous, a last-minute decision to take a scenic detour through the mountains on their way back from a music festival. Sam, Ethan, and Lily were buzzing with adrenaline, the music still ringing in their ears as they sped down the narrow, winding highway. As night fell, fog crept in, thick and blinding, swallowing the headlights. The GPS flickered, struggling to maintain a signal. "There's a gas station coming up," Ethan said, squinting at the screen. It was the only sign of civilization for miles. The gas station appeared suddenly out of the mist, its neon sign flickering weakly. It was old, the kind of place that seemed frozen in time with peeling paint and a rusty pump. "Are you sure this place is even open?" Lily asked, eyeing the dark windows. "It's our only option," Sam replied, pulling in. Ethan went to fill the tank while Sam and Lily ventured inside. The air was stale, and the shelves were sparsely stocked with dusty snacks and faded magazines. Behind the counter, an old man sat in silence, his eyes glassy and unfocused. Hello?" Sam said. The man didn't respond, just stared past them. "Lily's just grab something and go." As they paid, the man finally spoke, his voice raspy and low. "You kids shouldn't be out here after dark." Sam raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" The man's gaze sharpened, and he leaned forward slightly. "Things walk in the fog. Stay on the road. Don't stop, no matter what you see." Unnerved, they hurried back to the car, finding Ethan already in the driver's seat, engine running. "Let's get out of here," he said, his voice tense. The fog seemed even thicker as they drove, the world beyond the headlights a shapeless void. They followed the GPS, which directed them onto a narrower road, the pavement cracked and overgrown. "This can't be right," Lily said, gripping the seat. "It's the only way," Ethan replied, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Minutes stretched into hours. The road twisted and turned, looping back on itself, and the fog seemed alive, pressing against the windows. Then they saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road. Ethan slammed the brakes, the car skidding to a stop. The figure didn't move. It was a woman, barefoot and dressed in a tattered white gown, her hair hanging in wet, dark strands over her face. "Is she hurt?" Lily whispered. "Don't," Sam said, his voice low. But Ethan was already rolling down the window. "Hey, do you need help?" The woman's head jerked up, and Lily gasped. Her eyes were black pits, her mouth stretched into a twisted grin. Before anyone could react, the woman moved, fast, too fast, slamming her hands against the hood of the car. Ethan floored the gas pedal, the tires screeching as they sped away. For a moment, the road was clear, but then they heard it. The sound of footsteps, impossibly fast, keeping pace with the car. Lily turned, screaming, as she saw the woman running alongside them, her face pressed against the window. "Drive faster!" Sam shouted. Ethan pushed the car to its limit, the speedometer climbing, but the woman didn't fall behind. Then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. They didn't stop. Not until they saw lights in the distance, a small diner at the edge of the fog. They stumbled inside, breathless and shaking, collapsing into a booth. The waitress approached, her expression unreadable. "You kids look like you've seen a ghost," Sam laughed nervously. "Something like that." The waitress set down a pot of coffee and paused, her eyes narrowing. "You didn't stop on the road, did you?" Ethan shook his head. "No? Well, just for a second." The waitress's face fell. "You shouldn't have done that." Before they could respond, the lights flickered and the fog outside thickened, curling against the windows like grasping fingers. The sound of footsteps echoed, growing louder, closer. And then they saw her again, standing just outside the glass, her black eyes staring in. The last thing they heard was the shattering of the diner's windows and the screams of the other patrons. By morning, the fog had cleared and the diner stood empty, its door swinging gently in the breeze. The car was found miles away, abandoned, its doors open and its occupants missing. The locals say the fog comes back every few years, and with it, the woman who walks the road. If you see her, don't stop, don't slow down, and whatever you do, don't look back.
Story number 8.
Claire had been desperate for a break. Between her demanding job and the stress of city life, the idea of renting a quiet lakeside cabin sounded perfect. When she found an ad for a secluded retreat deep in the woods, it seemed too good to be true. Escape the chaos, it promised. Total solitude and serenity. When she arrived, the cabin was even more picturesque than the photos, perched on the edge of a still, glassy lake, surrounded by towering pines. The air was crisp and silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves. She felt the tension in her shoulders begin to melt away. The first day passed peacefully. She read on the porch, dipped her feet in the cool water, and marveled at the absence of noise. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, she felt truly relaxed for the first time in months. That night, Claire woke suddenly. At first, she wasn't sure why. The cabin was dark, the one coming from the moon outside her window. Then she heard it, a faint knocking sound. It was soft, irregular, like something gently tapping against the wood of the cabin. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Probably just a branch, she told herself. But the sound didn't stop. It moved, first at the wall near the front door, then closer to her bedroom window. Gathering her courage, Claire crept to the window and peered out. The lake shimmered under the moonlight, and the woods were still. Nothing seemed out of place. The tapping stopped, and after a few minutes of silence, she went back to bed. The next morning, she dismissed it as her imagination. She spent the day exploring the woods, finding wildflowers, and listening to the birds. When she returned to the cabin, she noticed something strange. In the dirt outside the porch, there were footprints. They weren't hers. They were bare, human, and much too large for a child. They circled the cabin, stopping beneath each window. A chill ran down her spine, but she shook it off. Probably just some hiker, she muttered, though she didn't believe it. That night, the tapping returned. Louder this time, more insistent. Claire stayed in bed, clutching the blankets to her chest, her heart racing. When the sound moved to her window, she couldn't stop herself from looking. There, in the moonlight, was a face. It was pale, almost luminous, with wide, unblinking eyes and a mouth stretched into a grotesque grin, its head tilted slightly, as if curious. Claire screamed, stumbling back and knocking over the lamp. When she looked again, the face was gone. She spent the rest of the night with every light in the cabin on, a knife clutched in her shaking hands. At dawn, she packed her things, determined to leave. But when she stepped outside, her car wouldn't start. The engine sputtered and died, no matter how many times she turned the key. Panicked, she grabbed her phone to call for help, but there was no signal. The footprints were back, fresh in the dirt, circling the cabin again. This time, there were handprints on the windows, smudged and greasy. Claire decided to walk. She remembered passing a ranger station on her way to the cabin, and though it was miles away, she knew she couldn't stay another night. As she made her way down the dirt road, the forest seemed darker than before. The towering trees pressed in, and every rustle of leaves made her jump. She kept glancing over her shoulder, sure she was being watched. Then she heard it. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and far too close. She broke into a run, her heart pounding as the footsteps quickened behind her. She didn't dare look back. When she finally reached the ranger station, she pounded on the door, screaming for help. An older ranger opened it, his face wrinkled with concern. "What happened?" he asked, ushering her inside. Claire poured out her story, her voice trembling. When she finished, the ranger's expression darkened. "You're lucky you made it," he said grimly. "Not everyone does." "What are you talking about?" Claire asked, her skin crawling. "There's a reason that cabin's always available," he replied. "People say something lives out there by the lake, something that doesn't like to be disturbed." Claire never went back for her car or her belongings. She returned to the city, but the nightmares followed her, and sometimes, late at night, she swore she could still hear the faint tapping on her apartment window. But she never dared to look.
Story number 9.
When Emma and her fiancé Jack checked into the Grandview Hotel, they were struck by its old-world charm. The building was a relic of the early 1900s, with gilded chandeliers, ornate staircases, and a lobby that seemed to whisper stories of a bygone era. "We'll have it all to ourselves," Jack said, spinning Emma around in the empty ballroom. The hotel had been closed for renovations, but the manager had allowed them to book one of the upper suites for their weekend getaway. The room was stunning. A canopy bed, a marble fireplace, and a view of the surrounding forest that stretched for miles. "It's like stepping back in time," Emma said, running her fingers along the antique furniture. That night, the air in the room felt heavy. Emma woke to the sound of faint music, the tinkling notes of a piano drifting through the walls. "Jack," she whispered, nudging him awake. He groaned. "What is it? Do you hear that?" They both listened. The music was soft but unmistakable, a haunting melody that sent chills down Emma's spine. "Probably just an old sound system," Jack mumbled, rolling over. "This place is ancient." Emma wasn't convinced, but she forced herself to sleep. The next day they explored the hotel. The halls were eerily quiet, the air thick with dust. As they wandered, Emma noticed something odd. Every mirror they passed was covered with a heavy cloth. "Why do you think they're covered?" she asked. Jack shrugged. "Maybe they're trying to preserve them during the renovations." But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching them. That evening, as they sat by the fireplace, Emma brought up the music. "It wasn't a sound system, Jack. It sounded real." "You're just letting this place get to you," Jack said, pulling us. But Emma wasn't so sure. Later that night, she woke again. This time, it wasn't music that stirred her. It was the sound of footsteps, faint but deliberate, pacing the hallway outside their door. She held her breath, straining to hear. The steps stopped just outside their room. "Jack," she hissed, shaking him awake. "What now? There's someone out there." Jack sighed, grabbing his phone for light. He opened the door, revealing an empty hallway. "See? Nothing." Emma clutched the blanket tighter. "I don't like this place." Jack locked the door and climbed back into bed, but Emma barely slept. The next morning, she insisted on leaving, but Jack convinced her to stay one more night. "It's just an old hotel. You're letting your imagination run wild." Emma reluctantly agreed, but unease churned in her gut. That evening, as they prepared for bed, Emma noticed one of the cloths covering the mirror in their room had slipped. A sliver of glass was visible, reflecting the flickering light of the fireplace. "Jack," she said, her voice trembling. "What?" She pointed to the mirror. In the glass, she saw the two of them and a third figure standing in the corner. It was a woman in a long black gown, her face pale and sunken, her eyes dark hollows. Emma screamed, spinning around, but the corner was empty. "What? What is it?" Jack demanded. "The mirror!" There was someone in the mirror. Jack checked the mirror, pulling the cloth away. It showed only their reflections, though Emma swore she saw a faint smudge where the woman had stood. "We're leaving," she said, her voice firm. Jack didn't argue this time. They packed quickly, but as they reached the lobby, the music started again. Louder, more insistent. It came from the ballroom, the melody weaving through the air like a taunt. "Let's go," Emma whispered, pulling Jack toward the exit. But as they passed the ballroom, the doors creaked open. The grand piano sat in the center of the room, its keys moving as if played by invisible hands. And then Emma saw her. The woman from the mirror stood by the piano, her head tilted, her hollow eyes fixed on them. Emma and Jack bolted, racing out into the cold night. They didn't stop until they reached their car, the distant sound of the piano following them into the forest. The next morning, Emma called the hotel to report what they had experienced, but the line was disconnected. Curious, she searched online and found an article about the Grandview Hotel's dark past. In the 1920s, a famous pianist had stayed there, a woman who'd been found dead in her suite, her body slumped over the piano. Since then, guests had reported strange occurrences: music in the dead of night, covered mirrors slipping free, and the apparition of a woman in black. Emma and Jack never spoke of their experience again, but Emma still avoids mirrors at night. Sometimes, out of the corner of her eye, she thinks she sees her, the woman in black, standing just behind her reflection.